Hello, and welcome to another episode of Connecting Climate Capital. My name is Alex Cruzel, CEO and founder of Telesto Strategy, and I'm delighted that we have two global thought leaders joining us today for a very in-depth, candid discussion about some of the latest and greatest trends in this space. Before I introduce them and my colleague, I'd like to set the stage. One of the things we're thinking about as a global network, an ecosystem of professionals who care about climate, sustainability, inclusive economic models, is the question of the gap in climate financing. For those on the call, they're quite aware, but again, raising awareness on some of these topics is paramount to finding solutions. And that's where we'd like to orient the conversation today. So the gap is significant. It's more and more understood every year. Funds are being mobilized in a very aggressive way, but not aggressive enough. The question we're looking to explore more broadly with the series, and we'll hone in on elements today, is what's really preventing countries, infrastructure projects, entities, governments from attracting a greater share of climate capital? What's the disconnect? And what are some tactical solutions, strategic solutions, long-term solutions to mitigating this? We work across the climate capital continuum at Telesto, so we see the vantage from investors, from the investees, those in between. And what we're trying to foster through the series and these convenings is to foster the connective tissue, to facilitate, de-risk, and really mobilize the capital that's needed for more sustainable, inclusive, resilient futures. So different aspects of the conversation, this is a reference point for others, might touch on some of these questions. I look forward to hearing more about all of these. But no, our overarching goal is to build up this ecosystem, that connective tissue that can make the activation of this capital much more expedient and impactful. There's some terminology you may be hearing throughout. Just as a reference point, one of the greatest pieces of this challenge in the ecosystem is you need a lot of these columns to come together and overlap in synchrony. And a lot of times that doesn't happen. You need the public, you need the private financing actors to come together with shared objectives. And then the financial instrument needs to make sense, as well as the projected return, be it financial, social, environmental, or beyond. So you can see the inherent complexity in activating this climate capital. And we call attention to these as, again, our esteemed guest today, as well as my colleague Andrew, might be referencing these. Finally, I'd like to just share briefly a little bit more about Telesto's journey. We are a younger firm, but we've been very much focused and pulled into the conversation of climate capital. Recently hosting an official White House side event related to connecting climate capital with a focus on Africa. Thereafter, participating in a Department of State delegation focused on climate entrepreneurship in Ghana. We've kicked off these series formally with the Department of State Office of Global Partnerships and the Coalition for Climate Entrepreneurship. And as of late, as of a month ago or so, we've launched a climate tech accelerator, actually in Ghana, where again, another way we as Telesto can help sort of fill this void and activate this capital. So much more to come. We'll keep everyone up to date in terms of what are some future convenings that we'll be a part of. For those of you who don't know Telesto, very briefly, we do help actors across that continuum, whether it means ESG investor readiness, again, across that continuum. How do you get to net zero roadmap? That's a part of being ESG and investor ready these days. We're promoting that and we're helping our partners do that. The tone needs to be set at the top, and we understand that leadership executive teams are looking to be more informed of these trends. We do those types of trainings and learning offerings. The green financing trend is huge. It's part of why we're here today. And so making sure that those resources and tools are available to the investors and targets looking for them. We do believe more than anything, sustainability, ESG, inclusive growth, all these things need to be inherent and applied at the highest level of an organizational strategy. We push for those things. We work with like-minded organizations who believe the same, that one doesn't have to be at the expense of the other. And then what's exciting about this movement is it's evidence-based in a meaningful way. So we know at the heart of a lot of these decisions and programs is the data, the veracity, the quality, the comprehensiveness. So we do also work towards ensuring that our partners are ready and able to report on those magnificent outcomes, and maybe not so magnificent when there's areas to improve. With that, that's my brief overview in terms of why we're here, the challenges at hand, and hopefully an opportunity here as we embark in this conversation to think both strategically and tactical. What are some things that those learning from the experts on this call can take away today, tomorrow, and a year from now and bring to their organizations? So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my very capable colleague, Andrew, who will introduce our speakers. So thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So we're very privileged to be joined by not only one, but two speakers today, two distinguished guests. We have Joyce Coffee, who's the president of Climate Resilience Consulting, and a good friend of ours at Telesto. We also, she's joined by Brandy Espinola, who's the Climate Resilience and Sustainability Program Manager at the Environmental Finance Center with the University of Maryland. Very excited to have you both on board. I understand that we are lucky enough to also have a brief presentation from both of you. So without further ado, I'll pass it first to Joyce, and I think Joyce, you'll project some slides to help deliver that.
Yeah, well, so thank you so much, both Alex and Andrew. We are so excited to be here with you today. Brandy and I have been working together for many years on really pioneering the climate resilience field. And I head up the climate resilience consulting practice based in Chicago. We're a global firm that focuses on saving lives and improving livelihoods in the face of climate change disruption. And our clients refer to us as being small but mighty. In part, that's because we've really set the bar for ensuring that climate change resilience is, in fact, the answer to the climate question. How will we do the sorts of things that Telesto strategy is leading its clients to do to get to net zero, and to, in fact, as we do so, also ensure that the communities that we care so deeply for are whole, even in the face of more extreme heat, flooding, drought, wildfire, food insecurity, and other knock-on impacts. One of the things that we've been really proud to pioneer is ESG plus resilience, which is a way of looking at the concept that many of us have worked in for years around sustainability in a new light, from the perspective of risk mitigation, liability reduction, and new finance and funding. We are really focused here at Climate Resilience Consulting on pre-disaster hazard mitigation strategy and on ensuring that risk management leadership and the communities of practice that are required to make sure resilience is a part of our communities happen based on science-based information, just like we are, of course, in this field approaching science-based targets for greenhouse gas reductions. One of the things that I wanted to share very briefly, Andrew, before we get into the Q&A, is some of the trends that we've noticed in the field of climate change resilience. And I think many of the existing trends, everyone on the phone here has already been a part of. So I'm not going to go too far into the energy efficiency, health and environment, thinking about procurement. I really want to hone in on the emphasis that we are seeing to pile on what, Alex, you just mentioned around industry trends. We are seeing huge emphasis on resilience. And we're seeing this in many of the sectors that are required, with perhaps one glaring exception, and that is the financial services industry. So I want to just help us think about this a little bit from the perspective of risk information, growing social risks, extreme weather, and some of these other trends that we've noted. The first is that, especially because of the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, as well as many real drivers from government stakeholders, we know that risk information is becoming more and more important from the perspective of extreme weather risks, and understanding what we need to disclose and when we need to disclose it, and especially what sorts of scenarios we're using for this effort of ensuring we are seeking solutions to a future that looks so different from our past. We really believe it's important here at Climate Resilience Consulting to build resilience for all rather than avoiding risk for some, and risk information can really help us to do that. One of the more profound trends that we see, of course, is a growing social inequity because climate change is unfair. disenfranchised communities are hit first and worst by climate change impacts. And so it's really up to all of us to use that at-risk information to solve for social risks in order to create climate resilience. And until we do that, we actually don't have much climate resilience, in part because social risks are driving migration. Homeowners and just people around the world are having to migrate from flood and fire risk. Many of them are able to do so with agency if they have money, but most of them are having to do so in flight. And so when we think about the world of climate capital, we often ask the question of where will the stranded assets be? That's a very common question in the financial services continuum of climate actors. Typically, we're talking about, for instance, a coal-fired power plant or some big emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. But figure this, the biggest stranded asset in a climate changed world are poor people. And it's up to us in the context of thinking about climate capital to ensure that funds from the private sector along from government sector are flowing to ensure that more people have agency in where they move in the context of a climate changed world. Of course, part of how we'll do that is industry will see a competitive advantage for being climate change resilient. I know Telesto, you have sought and achieved real leadership in your field because you have made resilience a part of the package that you deliver to your clients. We know that those who are able to embrace and manage climate change resilience really focus on how to make sure disruption doesn't further exacerbate, business lack of continuity, make sure that recovery is bouncing forward, not just stasis, and seeking to capitalize on the new normal, including through these extraordinary competitions that Telesto you're working through now in Ghana. We will see an increased competitive advantage. And for those who choose not to be on that leading edge of climate, there is likely to be an investment risk. Certainly, some of the largest investors, at least in the United States, are on record to say that if you are not a part of the climate change solution, you will no longer be a tasty and tempting investment. So access to climate capital requires that you assess your climate risks, which aren't just the hazard itself, but also what is exposed and who is most vulnerable to that exposure and hazard. And then you need to be able to actually adapt to those risks by putting in place a lot of major climate resilience practice. So we are certain that all of us can thrive in a climate resilience decade, and we look forward to working with all of you on that prospect. And I'm going to turn it over now to Brandy, who's going to share more about some of the prospects of that work from her perspective.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joyce. I'm going to pull out my slides. So again, my name is Brandy Espinola. I'm the Climate and Sustainability Program Director at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland. We at the Environmental Finance Center do a lot of work building the capacity of governments across the United States. The climate change, as we all know, is a global problem, but whose impact is going to be felt most intensely at the local level. And so as we're already seeing the climate change, we're seeing how that's rippling, those effects are rippling through communities, exacerbating existing problems and stretching already strained budgets. And this can be true whether we're talking about the public sector or the private sector. Those changes are already being felt. So this is leaving decision makers with increasingly more difficult choices and shifting how we operate. However, while climate change is a global crisis beyond the control of any one community or organization, there are clear actions that can be taken to help mitigate and adapt. So at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center, we work at a local level, building the capacity of governments to begin integrating climate action and resilience into their operations. This is helping to better prepare communities for uncertainty and reframe this potential scary time as an opportunity for transformation into what will hopefully lead to more equitable and just thriving communities. For us, we think about finance and funding as a much larger process for communities. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there are certainly many steps that need to occur before a community is ready to have a conversation about dollars and cents. And so the approach that we take is really thinking about how funding and financing fits within the core functions of a government. And I would say that this approach isn't relegated to just how governments function, but it's a holistic approach that could be applied to any institutions, really. So things like assessing and mitigating communities' natural hazards and related risks, as Joyce was talking about, is a core function of any institution, making sure that they're able to provide continuity of operations and services, whether on a day-to-day basis or following a disaster that affects the quality of life for the people in that community. Building infrastructure and maintaining assets is a huge priority, especially for governments. But again, many institutions across the globe are facing how do we build infrastructure and maintain those assets in a changing climate. Developing plans that set priorities, long-range goals, and objectives is another piece of those core functions, as well as establishing and enforcing a variety of policies and regulations that will help communities to protect public safety, conserve natural environment, and encourage economic growth. So developing sufficient and sustainable financial support for these resilience initiatives, these climate initiatives, is just one piece of these larger functions. And of course, we know that good governance can't occur without aligning efforts with community priorities and engaging diverse voices in the process. So that's really the approach that we take at the Environmental Finance Center as we're talking to communities and various stakeholders about how do we think about funding and financing in the context of this new changing climate. So really quickly, one of the things that we really focus on is developing a balanced strategy, right? There are many different activities that a community can do that is before we even, again, start talking about the revenue streams that are going to help fund the projects on the ground. And so we really work with communities to think about what are the opportunities for reducing costs within their current operations? How do they increase governance efficiencies? So that includes things like integrating their planning processes, thinking about their capital improvement programs, making really sure to understand their assets and what things are going to be most vulnerable, and then engaging in public-private partnerships or looking at opportunities to take advantage of different tax credits and rebates, etc. After we think about how do we reduce costs and increase efficiencies, we really then explore various options, various revenue streams. So for our communities, oftentimes that's looking at things like taxes and fees, but more and more exploring the bonds and the loans and all innovative opportunities for financing. Some of the things that we have when we talk to our communities that we really focus on, sort of the big takeaways, is recognizing that there is no magic bullet. Every community, every institution, every organization is going to have a different strategy for how they think about financing and funding with regards to their projects and their initiatives. We really work to help build the capacity of communities to build out and get prepared for when new opportunities hit the ground. So considering funding and financing options really early in their planning processes, evaluating available cost share options, and thinking about blended finance. Can we match public and private dollars together to get things done? And really having a really clear portfolio of viable projects that they know that they want to implement. And then integrating resilience into already existing infrastructure projects. So these are some things that we have been really seeing have been effective with working with the governments that we do here in the States, and that we think are some of the key strategies for making sure that projects can be funded. We also really advise our communities to seek technical partnerships with those who are really familiar with funding and financing to assist with the project development phase. We recognize that a lot of the folks who are going to be responsible for implementing the resilience projects that help protect their communities aren't those same folks who really understand the financing mechanisms and the funding that's out there. And so partnering with those who do is really helpful. And then, especially with smaller communities, we encourage sort of partnering community projects together and developing a larger portfolio to really be able to reach higher scales that might be enticing to private sector funding, and that really can help expand benefits across a larger population. And then lastly, and I think Joyce touched on this earlier, really, again, we need to work with our communities to make sure that there's diversified strategies for funding and financing, and that they're not relying on one single source. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing with regards to our work specifically with governments. But again, we see this as good rules of thumbs that can be used really across institutions. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity, and happy to take some questions now.
Thanks very much, Brandy, and thanks as well, Joyce. So really appreciate setting the scene here with these two different presentations, and I think both had a lot of very rich factoids and perspectives in them. Just to get things kicked off here with the Q&A, Joyce, I wanted to ask you first. You know, you clearly have a lot of passion for the field and sort of a unique approach to it. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what led you to getting involved in the work that you're doing on climate resilience?
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I hope more people choose to take on climate resilience, Andrew. So maybe I can entice them with this. You know, for me, I think there were really three drivers. The first is that water has always been the red thread through my work. And if you're talking about too much water when we don't need it and not enough water when we do, you're talking about resilience. And most communities in the world face both of those risks at one time or another. And the knock-on impact of those risks is really significant to the value chain, in particular to transporting goods and services, and also to the safety and security of the workforce. So that was number one. Number two, actually, 20 or so years ago when I got involved in this field, I was working for government that wanted to do something about decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, but they were also very keen on things that the constituent cared about. I mean, an ethereal metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, most of us can't even get our arms around that. But we do love things like, rain gardens and a beautiful place for people to have lunch, and, ways to improve air quality and how to make public health a lot better. And so that basket of things that we wanted to be part of climate action, but really fit more in like sustainability, resilience, wasn't getting done. And I really wanted to take those on. But then the last thing was, and I think this is really profound for this international audience, when the Paris Agreement was signed, if you look carefully at the Paris Agreement from the Conference of the Parties, the word adaptation appears much more frequently than the word mitigation. At that moment, leaders realized that we had not done nearly enough to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and now we had to work hard to avoid the risks that we could no longer prevent. In addition, right around the time of the Paris Agreement, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Perception Survey was coming out. And the 5 top risks of that perception survey, food insecurity, energy insecurity, war, and of course, the failure of climate change adaptation and mitigation, I can't recall the fifth at this moment, they were all about climate change resilience. And I was like, holy cow, all right, this is the moment. We've got to be sure that we double down on this. So that's why it's been a major focus for us.
Thanks, Joyce. Brandy, I'd like to ask you the same question. I mean, you come to a slightly different perspective on the topic, in that you're really focusing at it from the government angle, the public sector angle, in particular within the United States. How is it that you came to be sort of as active in resilience, and particularly from the public sector angle as you are?
Yeah, I would say that I came in through sustainability, right? And so sustainability is really about thinking through how do we make sure that we have enough resources now to continue into the future. And we'd work with a lot of communities on projects such as community gardens and greening projects, a lot of stormwater infrastructure projects. But what we found was that things started shifting, right? And that the plan and the projects that they're putting in the ground now are not the same sort of project that they're going to need moving forward. And so we've really shifted from thinking about things from the sustainability angle to how is it that this is going to be protecting the community, serving the community 5 years down the line, when the amount of water that's coming in through storms is much more, or when the tree canopy is suffering because they are being too vulnerable to heat increases and things of that nature. So I would say from our perspective, it's really just shifting from the concept of sustainability to resilience, just because of the need and the fact that we're seeing increased storms, and we're seeing increased flooding, increased heat events that are causing some of the sustainability projects that have been put in the ground just 5 years ago, putting those things at risk. So really thinking about that shift to thinking forward looking instead of what was happening in the past.
That makes a lot of sense. And since it came up sort of in your response there, Brandy, I wonder if both of you in turn could sort of talk about, and given that this is a climate finance focused podcast or a webinar, if you could talk about whether or not you're seeing financial flows also sort of gravitating towards resilience. I mean, I like that statistic you brought up, Joyce, about the very infrequent mention of the word mitigation and the very frequent word use of the word adaptation. Are the financial flows matching that? And if so, you know, or if not, what can be done to sort of reconcile the two, the reality from what the financial flows are doing?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting because, you know, you would think that with so many leaders deciding that adaptation really mattered, you would see more funding and finance to adaptation. But it turns out, I'm sure many listeners are aware of the Climate Policy Initiative stock take of where the funding and finance flows are going for climate action. You know, by 2021, it was something like $632 billion were moving in that direction, with 51% of that money coming from the public sector, be that like the development finance institutions or individual governments. But of that amount, it's so interesting, 90% of that was actually for greenhouse gas reductions, mitigation, which, by the way, what is the number one thing we need to do to adapt to climate change? Mitigate. If we don't mitigate with all of our heart and soul, we're never going to be able to survive. You know, the mission of our firm will not be possible. Saving lives and improving livelihoods starts with greenhouse gas reduction. But it is kind of astounding that, you know, 90% of total climate finance is for mitigation, with adaptation is increasing. I will say, like, for instance, from 2020 to 2022, it increased 53%, which is pretty profound. And of course, we do see money going to these dual uses of both mitigation and adaptation, which is, you know, the holy grail. Like, let's find more incredible technologies coming out of Africa that do both, right? That would be fantastic. But I do wonder what it will take to really pivot the private sector towards more climate adaptation funding and financing. And I think Brandy touched on this a little bit, but I do want to point out that there is a sense in the financial services industry that adaptation is not bankable, that it doesn't make money, you know, not the same way of a wind turbine being able to, you know, sell its power. I do want to take some issue with that there's a lot of resilience projects that when pairing, for instance, growing revenue with a risk mitigation project, you actually do see revenue. But I'm going to end on one thing that Alex touched on. It's pretty sobering to me. So just last week, France, Macron brought together folks from many different countries from the global south and global north to talk about the climate finance conundrum. And the world agreed at that time that the problem had a price tag, that is, the climate problem has a price tag of trillions of dollars, rather than what we had talked about in the past, which was hundreds of billions. And, you know, we did have Janet Yellen showing up, which was nice, but most of the global north did not come. What really turned out to be was that it was the global south saying, where is the money? And there isn't a lot of finance movement, in spite of the, you know, sovereign leaders saying that there should be. So I really challenge everyone listening to think about how you could actually pivot your portfolio, for instance, to demand more on the resilience side.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Brandy, I'd like to get your perspective on this as well. I mean, I think from the government's perspective, any adaptation project could be considered bankable if it means saving lives, right? I guess it just really depends on where you believe the value to be concentrated. What do you make of the fact that globally, so little of investment that's climate driven is in these kinds of adaptation projects versus mitigation projects?
Yeah, actually, Joyce and I were talking about this the other day, and we were discussing how mitigation seems so much more bankable. The other thing that we had discussed was just the fact that adaptation is so localized, right? And that the types of projects are going to have to be incredibly unique, and oftentimes might have competing priorities at the local level, so that we make sure that the way things are being implemented on the ground at the local level is not maladaptive. And so one of the things that Joyce and I were talking about specifically was that especially private dollars tend to really like scale. And when we're talking about local adaptation, it's really hard to find that scale to entice and bring in those large dollars in order to put projects on the ground. And so we have to start thinking, as Joyce was mentioning, more creatively about how are we defining bankability and how are we pulling together various projects, perhaps, to get more adaptation projects on the ground at scale. And it's really sort of, I think, breaking through that, that perspective that small projects or local projects aren't that enticing, because we really think that's where the huge adaptation is going to occur, is really at that local scale.
And one more thing, if I could just, Andrew.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think major investors have an opportunity here because warehousing is possible. I mean, we do it in the renewable energy space too, right? Small projects get clumped together, so an investor gets excited and he says, well, this is worth my time because it's over, the 7 figures or whatever it is that I need to see on my balance sheet. So I do know that we see green banks, for instance, being really fundamental in helping to inspire this warehousing of projects so that we then have investors that are more keen on the projects. And the other thing that I think green banks can be really good at is helping an investor who's been mitigation only, because that's kind of the groove, that if you're a social investor or if you're a climate active investor, you are thinking mitigation. The green bank can say, hey, have you turned the page on the chapter to the next one, which is here's this next set of adaptation things. And one more thing I wanted to say about that is that I do think a new era of younger investors might really get a little more inspired by this, because one of the biggest inequities of climate change is that the next generation is inheriting such an incredible mess. And I think they see the possibility of putting money in risk mitigation as one way to ensure that the communities that they care about don't suffer too grievously.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if you take a slightly different perspective on this, right? So I wanted to pull that thread a little bit further around this bankability question, and that maybe part of it is just not looking at this from the right perspective. Joyce, I know you think frequently about the intersection between resilience and their underrepresented communities. It strikes me that one could make the argument that yes, fine, mitigation of a solar power plant is more likely to, or a solar power farm is more likely to make a return on investment than, say, for example, a seawall or a bioswale or something like that. But what is certainly left out of it is the sort of question about the S component of ESG, right? Where there's just a much bigger opportunity for a mitigation project, an adaptation project to be protective of underrepresented communities in a way that sort of a solar farm is not. What do you have to say about that? You're on mute, Joyce.
So I think the thing that is really interesting about this is that the Development Finance Institution has grappled with this already. They're saying to themselves, wow, we already have these streams of poverty alleviation dollars. Like, are we allowed to count these as also climate adaptation? And, because actually Alex pointed out how incredibly important it is to get our numbers right. Like, this is big. And so it's really interesting when a very large financier, in this case, the World Bank Group, asked that question, like, can the poverty alleviation work we do also be counted for adaptation? And of course, I don't know what the inside baseball has been there, but ultimately we're seeing a lot more of their numbers being counted for climate adaptation. And from the perspective of a corporate investor, this is so incredibly exciting, really, honestly. If you care about affordable housing, if you care about public health, start with those things. Because if you actually shore those things up, you are building climate resilience for your communities, no doubt. That's been, I think, one of the more interesting parts of our practice is how frequently we can have individuals who have previously not considered themselves climate activists, and maybe they don't even after having spent a year with us, but they are very keen on things like making sure that people have a safe, secure, and stable place to live, and that they have health, like air that they can breathe, so that they can do the job that they're asked to do really well. These data you mentioned earlier, like, well, it seems like it's possible to have bankability if you're talking about avoiding loss of life. it's hard to talk about loss of life in the boardroom, but loss of productivity comes up a lot. And things like, extreme heat, the data are profound in terms of the amount of productivity loss we are already seeing in the outdoor workforce around the world as the wet bulb temperature increases. So I think that's one way to make sure that you are solving for multiple benefits, always asking, what's the public health possibilities here? What's the affordable housing possibilities here? You will very likely get to a climate adaptation solution when you do that.
Thanks, Joyce. Brandy, I think US governments maybe infamously or famously known for not being extremely proactive in their thinking on these kinds of things. And adaptation requires a bit of forward looking rather than reacting to sort of climate challenges after they've come. Are you seeing any sort of shift in people's perspectives within the public sector environment in the United States with respect to resilience and adaptation and therefore investing in those areas?
Yeah, most definitely. I would say that at least in the last couple of years, it was really sort of a groundswell coming from local government. So cities, towns, and states were taking the lead in terms of climate adaptation, thinking about how do you build climate action into your government processes. And luckily, in the last year or so, we've really seen the U.S. federal government starting to step in and say, this is important to us, and providing the funding and resources needed to take local action. And so we have started to see a shift. I think there's also just a shift in sort of social and cultural appetite for making sure that we hold our communities accountable and that they're taking those sorts of actions. And so there are, I think, a lot more private dollars, more public dollars, philanthropic dollars going towards climate adaptation at that local level, and all sorts of very cool sort of pilot projects that are taking off and hopefully going to be implemented at scale across the country.
And what do you see as the major factors that are driving that transition? Just to return to my preamble to the previous question, I was always shocked by how things like flood insurance, rather than sort of relocating, they would just continue to build up the same houses over and over and over again in the same places just to watch them get flooded again and again. I'm curious if now finally it's a financial question that is finally, they've gone past a tipping point and they're sick of these kinds of things and now are taking preventative action, or is it, I presume, a combination of different factors, but what in your mind are those combination of factors?
Yeah, well, I certainly think, as you mentioned, the sort of cascade of nationally declared disasters is a huge factor in that, right? We're seeing a lot more tornadoes, we're seeing sea level rise, we're seeing, sunny day flooding issues that are happening because of sea level rise. And so I think because of these number of various big disaster emergency issues that are having to be addressed, that there is this more proactive movement towards how do we become more resilient before a disaster hits. There's certainly that. I think there's also, as younger people are sort of moving into the workforce, an interest from the populace to take more action with regards to climate change, right? People are demanding that their communities, that the businesses that they are purchasing from, that sort of just society at large is taking this particular issue more seriously. And so I think between sort of seeing the writing on the walls because disasters are happening more frequently and this upcoming trend of just wanting to see more action taken, that those are two of the big drivers shifting the way that we're thinking about climate adaptation funding these days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Joyce, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I guess I want to just be sure that the record is clear. Andrew, it's true that for so long, these what we call repetitive loss properties, governments, not just the US government, but governments would put money back into them, because you want to make your constituents whole. But I will say that there has been a very significant shift in the last 20 months or so in the United States towards really moving away from perverse incentives that, the law currently does require that you build back the same way in the same place. So much of the money, at least from the federal government in the United States, that's coming out of the new bill, this Inflation Reduction Act, in fact, does fund things like moving people out of harm's way, and does require that you invest in resilience, not just building back the same. So that kind of pivot can take a long time. I mean, it's not just the insurance industry that is a barge that moves slowly. Pretty much every industry, except for maybe Silicon Valley and all those Ghanaian companies that you're now working with, moves pretty slow. But this could be the turning point, right? If we actually see that the funding flows are going towards, new urban utopias, places of vitality, thinking about safety and security, not thinking about like it needs to be the way it was in the past. Because the past is no longer that great predictor of the future that it used to be. And all of us are now needing to think in scenario-based ways that we never had to before.
Yeah. All very encouraging. It is slow, but it is progress. Always great to hear. So I think we're going to wrap up here. And in so doing, I wanted to ask both of you sort of, what are you looking forward to in the climate and resilience space over the next 12 to 24 months? Brandy, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think Joyce touched on this a little bit, but the funding in the funding landscape in the U.S. has certainly shifted, and there's a lot more funding available for adaptation, mitigation, and all sorts of climate action. And so what I think I'm most excited about is hopefully building the capacity of local governments, the capacity of regions to accept these funds and really see impact on the ground. I think capacity building is sort of a missing link, right, between the funds that are starting to flow a little bit more freely now in adaptation, and those who are going to have to be able to receive those funds to get projects on the ground. And so over the next 12 months, 2 years, really, I think what I'm most excited about is being a part of helping to build that capacity and helping to get dollars on the ground. So
great. Yeah, and I would say something similar, but the bottom line is that you're no longer a cool kid in the corporate world if you haven't brokered conversations about risk mitigation from the physical impacts of climate change, and that didn't used to be true. So now you have to do not just GRI and CDP, Global Reporting Initiative, and CDP. You have to do the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and you have to think about these physical impacts, and you have to both assess what's going to happen with those and then address that. And I believe this is going to make so much difference for communities around the world who are going to see corporate leaders stand up for something that, you mentioned earlier, Brandy, climate resilience is so local. So they're actually going to be showing benefit in their communities by being climate resilience activists and leaders. And I'm very encouraged by that, because you can do a lot in 12 months. You can do a lot in 12 years. So it's net zero by 2030. It's net resilience by 2030. And then we really have thriving communities.
Great. Joyce and Brandy, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate the insight you've provided.
Thanks so much, Telesto. You guys are fantastic. We are following your lead.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Bye-bye.